Good morning, everyone. Is this on? Hey, Sam, how do I turn it on? Is on? Good morning, everyone. Might have gone on to standby or something, did it? Can you hear me now? Oh, yep. Can you hear me? How do I do that?
What's her name again?
Barbara. If you want to just grab a coffee, tea, settle in. We'll give it a couple more minutes for people who've been held up by the rain, and then we'll kick off. So just a couple more minutes. Thank you. Okay, everyone, if we'd like to take seats. And, oh yeah, okay. Glad you know how to do that. And I'd just like to welcome you all here on this very rainy and inclement day. But we are very pleased to have you here for what we hope will be a very exciting and thought-provoking conversations throughout the day. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Laura Barnes. I work at QCOS, and together with Logan Together, that's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Together with Logan Together, we are very pleased to welcome you here today. Before I go any further, I would like to pay my acknowledgements and respects to the traditional owners of the land that we meet on here in Brisbane, the Yuggera and the Turrbal people, but also to the traditional owners of the land across Queensland, where we do our work, where you do your work, and where this event is being streamed today. It was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I am honoured through all our work to be able to learn from the traditional owners, from the oldest living culture in the world. A little bit of housekeeping to kick us off for today. So for those of you who aren't aware, we are live streaming this event. So watch what you say. It's being recorded as well and will be put up on the internet in perpetuity. So we all watch our P's and Q's. So for that purpose, if you do not consent to having your photo taken or you do not wish to be part of the live streaming, please let us know, put your hand up, and we'll ensure that that doesn't happen. Toilets are around, you can get to them from both sides, but we ask you, particularly during the live streaming, if you can use the doorway on this side, that would be useful, and there's ladies on this end, men's on that end. In the case of an emergency evacuation, I think we all run hell for leather down the stairs really quickly and huddle in the rain out the front. We do an evaluation of all of our events, so you will be sent an evaluation post today, and please encourage you to complete that. It helps us make sure our events are as good as they can possibly be and that we're meeting your needs as we host this event and others like it. And that's the housekeeping for today. So really, without further, Matthew's going to come up from Logan Together, say a few words, and then we'll get into the content of today. So before I do anything else, Matthew, would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, Laura. Welcome, everybody. If I could also acknowledge the Yuggera and Turrbal people who are the traditional custodians of the land here in Brisbane, and the Yuggera and Yugambeh people who are the custodians of the land in Logan, where Logan Together is home. I've got the job of telling you why I think today's discussion is important. And if you look at the seminar title, Evaluating Systems Change and Inquiry Framework, you're probably thinking that's amongst the dorkiest titles you've ever come across. But it's really important, and I think it's important for two reasons. We're about 4 years into doing stuff in our place-based change project in Logan. There's a whole bunch of communities around Australia who are similarly placed. And I think it's a critical time where people are starting to get impatient for results. We're not very good at waiting multiple years for things to change. And I think it's incredibly important as policy interest builds and as practice develops around Australia and internationally, that we're really realistic about what good looks like, what progress looks like, and we need to be good at describing what good looks like in this sort of waiting period as initiatives are building, as capabilities are building, but we're not yet seeing results, in our case, for little kids. That will take some time. We're still early in our program of doing the things that make a difference for kids. In fact, we've just come out of really an establishment phase where we've built the capacity to do anything through the relationships and the collaborative work and the institutional relationships. That's taken us a couple of years to get the capacity to do anything. We've then, for the last mainly 2 years, used that capacity that we built to start to do the things we think will make a difference, that will make change, to do different projects, to do stuff on the ground. And those projects, we're only, I was just saying to Mark before, we've probably got about 10 or 15 things we think we really need to do at population scale to make change for kids. We've probably only done 3 or 4 of them so far. We've actually only put them in the field. Now those things, so we've got to go from 3 or 4 things to 10 or 15 things, and then those things have to work. They then have to affect the lives of kids and families, and then those kids have to get old enough for anyone to notice that they're doing better or not. So it's a long game. And I was just joking before, it's a bit like, we seem to be able to do a long game when we're building like the Star Casino, right? So it's about a 6-year planning process for that sucker. It's going to be about a 4-year build. No one at the moment is saying, what's the guest satisfaction rating? Or are we making money? Those questions will come later. And we seem to be able to cope with that in that context. But uniquely and paradoxically, we're really bad at being patient in social policy, where the change is bigger and harder and the road is less certain, yet we're more impatient. So I think a evaluating systems change and inquiry framework, if you haven't already restrained yourself from jumping out of your seat to yell yeah, you will soon realise just how exciting this question really is. So I think that's the first reason. We really need to think critically about how we measure progress and how we instill patience in our stakeholders by telling this incredibly important story. Because I'm more convinced now than I was when we started that place-based social change is not the only answer, but it's a big chunk of the answer. It's really about a change in how we support, through the institutions of society and particularly institutions of government, people to do well and communities to do well. And it's a massive change agenda. So I think it's more important than it's more important than I thought when we started. The second reason this is important is because pretty much what I just said, it is really the easy work has now, for us, largely been done. It's the hard work in front of us, and that is changing the big systems, and the decisions that get made in George Street or in Canberra affect the lives of people in Logan. A lot of the issues we're facing now, those issues aren't affected by people in Logan. They're affected at the system level. And until we can pull the levers at the system level, which is about politics and about big bureaucracy and about big changes, and indeed, really a reconsideration of how our federation and our system of government works at the local level for the benefit of local people, we're going to struggle to see the change we want. That's the agenda. That's really what's ahead of us, is that systemic change. And I think we've got to be realistic. We won't achieve the population level results we want unless we can pull those levers. And that means a fundamental change in who gets to make decisions, how those decisions are coherent, where those decisions are made. And they're all big reforms to the system of government and the system of society in Australia. So that's why evaluating systems change and inquiry framework is perhaps going to be the highlight of your week, possibly month or year. Laura, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. And I'm not going to talk very much longer, really, so that we can jump into the exciting work of evaluating systems change. But it is my pleasure, I guess, to introduce our guest, Mark, and welcome him to Brisbane, to sunny Queensland. It is absolutely our honour to have you here today. I was lucky enough to first come across Mark's work when I went to Canada, to Toronto, for the Tamarack Institute's Festival of Change, and did a workshop similar to, I think, some of the content we'll cover today. It was a thought-provoking and exciting discussion. Made me think about the work that we do at QCOS differently and understand how important this idea of systems change really is. And you know, for us at QCOS, we see our role as being so. We play quite a unique role in this systems change discussion around how we connect some of the evidence that's coming through projects like Logan Together or bits of work like Logan Together, and connect that to government and to the systems and to our advocacy for change at a systems level. So how we measure that change, however, has always been a challenge, yeah? And this is where having conversations like today is so important, building our capacity to really understand what is the changes we're making and how do we know that we're making them. I'm not going to read Mark's bio. I've got it here. It's extensive, and we certainly sent that out to all of you as well. But really, I would just like to hand over to Mark now and say thank you very much for coming to talk to us, and please, everyone, welcome Mark Cabaj to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Let's just check the sound for the live streaming. Is it okay? Great. So thanks for the introductions. Thanks for having me back to your homeland and place. This is my second time here. The first time I was in, I'm embarrassed to say this, the Big Tower. I called it the Big Tower. What's the tower called? Tower of Power. The Tower of Power. Okay, so I'm not so far off. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And thanks for spending time coming out what you think is terrible weather, but I think you're wimps. This is nothing. I'm happy to be here for a couple of reasons. One of which is this is what it's like in my hometown right now in March in Edmonton. And we had a really rough winter, plus 32 in the summer, minus 34 in the winter. So it's been a grueling time period. And so this is a vacation for me, quite frankly. I also like this topic a little bit. You're right. You know what? I'm not good at titles. It's a terrible title. I apologize for that. But I love it, right? Some people, when they hear the word evaluation, they have the same response as they would to the word colonoscopy or root canal. And I love it. And I love it because for me, evaluation is reality testing. My whole life, I've been in complex change efforts and at multiple scales and multiple institutions. And evaluation is a backdoor to strategy, right? All innovators have hunches about the way the world works and how it could change. And evaluation says, how do you know what you think you know? Do you need some data for that? It asks us to slow down and consider other options. And in fact, I won't show you the diagram on the screen, but imagine two overlapping circles. Innovation on complex issues is a creative act. Would you agree? We have to be creative to solve complex, vexing issues. Evaluation is a critical act. It says, how do you know what you think you know? Are there other ways of looking at it? Are there other perspectives on this? And when we're evaluating complex change efforts, we're interested in that sweet spot in between. How can we get the innovators to be more reality testing oriented? And how can we get evaluators to slow down and make sure that they're doing their work in a way that helps, not hinders the innovators? And this really is a big challenge for our time because evaluation grew up in the projects in the United States for the most part, but it grew up here in Australia in the same way, in the United Kingdom and Canada, my home country, where it was really good at assessing discrete interventions and having high burdens of proof around whether or not these things were successful. And just like some kind of pharmaceutical drug, we would test that and then scale out a cookie cutter model. And that tradition and evaluation still exists. However, evaluation has not kept up to the fact that innovators don't think like that. We have interventions, some of which might be scaled, often not in a recipe-like format, but the change agenda is much bigger, broader, and longer than that. And evaluation is desperately trying to keep up. So for all of you who feel like there's orthodoxy and kind of like in the evaluation field, don't worry, there's no heresy that orthodoxy is only in some discrete places. The evaluation field is self-correcting. In fact, my dad was a superintendent of schools and he had a hat that said, I'm their leader, which way did they go? And I actually think evaluation needs a hat like that. The social innovators are off. Where are they? Can we hurry up and catch up and be somewhat useful? So I'm really, the evaluation field is self-correcting, and one of the areas that it has to self-correct is evaluating systems change. And so I look at this as a very dutiful piece of work to say, if we're going to be useful to evaluators, most innovators talk about systems change. By the way, the winter wasn't all bad. We had a lot of nice festivals this year, and Canadians are getting good at living in the winter. So here's what we're going to chat about. Why systems change, number one. What is the system and what does system change look like? How do we evaluate systems change? And so what are the implications for you? And I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and then have you chat for 5 or 6 minutes in small groups, and then we'll take questions for 15 minutes, and some of us will stay on for the afternoon and go a little bit deeper than that. Yes? Yes, thank you. And I changed it even up until last night based on some of my research, so there will be a copy sent out fairly shortly. It's already in the Dropbox. Thank you. So here's a great quote. Karen Pittman, Forum for Youth Investment in the U.S. in 2015 in Vancouver at a Tamarack Institute, came up with this phrase that sounds pretty good. She's a poet. Programmatic interventions help people beat the odds. Systems change interventions change their odds. If we're in the game of moving population level needles, we are in the game of systems change. There's no getting out of it. Programs can't tip systems. I was in New Hampshire a couple years ago, and we were talking about early childhood development programs in New Hampshire versus Quebec. And they were talking about the New Hampshire programs, and they were pretty cool, actually. If you've ever been to different parts in the U.S., they have real good, great clusters of early learning and care, and their programs were way more interesting than the ones in Quebec, but Quebec had far better early learning and care outcomes. Why? Quebec, in Canada, there's 12 months maternity leave, and if, depending on your employer, you can get topped up to 95% of your salary. Maybe it's going to be 18 months pretty soon. Number two, early learning and care centers, $5 a day. For early learning and care, $2,500 for university, like on and on. They live in an ecosystem that is so family and child friendly for a whole bunch of reasons, and there's a dark side to it, so I'm not going to overprivilege. I'm from the West, I can't compliment Quebec too much. But literally, public policy, systems, ecosystems make a difference, right? When we're often looking at situations where someone's not doing well, we can think about what biologists do. And when a frog is not healthy, you could look at the frog or you could look at the marsh and saying, what's wrong with the ecosystem that's making the frog so ill? So we are in the game of systems change. Here's another phrase. Systems change is about shifting the conditions that hold a problem in place, from Social Innovation Generation Canada, and this phrase has been adopted quite a bit, and recently by FSG and others. And I really think this is important because not only do systems hold a problem in place, sometimes they reproduce them, right? Problems get reproduced by systems. They keep routinely generating the same kinds of problems. So we really have to get our systems literacy up. And I think almost everyone now would say systems change rolls relatively easy off their tongue, but I don't know if we're that good at describing what the heck we mean, and that's why I love this quote from Donna Podums. I'm going to read it to you. I was asked to work with innovators in the national health program of a smaller country. When I started working with the group, they said, we aim to shift the health system. After listening for a few hours, I said, honestly, I have no idea what you're doing or what you're trying to achieve, and I haven't a clue how to measure it. I don't understand what it means to shift the health system. And they looked at each other and burst out laughing and said, we've no idea either. So I think we're there, folks. I think we all get it, like we get it. And then someone says, what's a systems change? It's not that easy to make sense of. So I feel this is an exemplar of our work. And the reason I was interested in coming to your work today is because I'm kind of like a community development voyeur. I like watching big systems change, and I was quite preoccupied with Canada for a while, and I still am and do work in the States, but I'm watching you folks quite a bit. Both the emphasis on place-based change is more powerful in Australia right now than it is in Canada. Stronger places at the federal government. Victoria's got a whole bunch of stuff going on. And you have something pretty special in Lisbon here with the organizations hosting the work that you're doing. So whether you like it or not, you're an exemplar, and we're watching what a really well-organized and committed group can do around some of these complex issues, and we're very happy that you're talking about systems change. So if we're all sort of on the cusp of this, here's what we wanted to deal with today. And how many people have read the book Getting to Maybe? No? Oh, folks. I know you got a big reading list, so I don't say this lightly, but it's getting to maybe how the world has changed. And it's all about social innovation, and it talks about the nature of social innovation, and has generated so many insights, at least that have helped us back home in Canada, the difference between simple, complicated, complex, the adaptive cycle, what it's like to be innovating when you think the world is applauding you and you feel like you're in cold, dark heaven, like, is this all there is? So there's really good insights in that book. And it was co-authored by a woman named Brenda Zimmerman. And when we were starting the Tamarack Institute, I said, Brenda, people are tackling complex issues. And when you talk about things like evaluating systems change, they're going to want tools and recipes. And she said, she was one of the greatest teachers I've ever met. She said, don't give people tools or techniques, they're just going to get to the wrong place faster. What we need to do is frame issues so they are coherent, not consistent, but can we make things coherent? Can we frame things so they're coherent? Offer principles to guide their thinking and action, and then offer them illustrative practices and aids for action so they can deal with them in their context. Now, this is important, right? What's the difference between a rule or a tool and a principle? If you come to a stop sign, what do? You're supposed to stop. What if you see a sign that says drive defensively? That's more of a principle. Because what a principle says is pay attention to your context, but I can't tell you what to do in that context. You have to use your noggin. If it's raining, maybe you slow down. If it's a school zone, you look both ways, etc. It says pay attention to this and respond in a context appropriate way. So what we're there's a lot going on with this right now around systems change, and we're just going to highlight the fact that there's so many good resources out there, aids for action, etc., that are context, that have to be applied in a context-specific manner. So when you go out there, there's tons of tools. If you're a tool junkie like me, you'll love it, right? Grab a six-pack of beer and a plate of nachos and just work through these things. They're a lot of fun for geeky people like me. However, a lot of them don't have framing, and that's what I wanted to deal with. Try and find a universal framing for systems change in a way that works for me, probably for you too. I work in lots of different systems change initiatives. So what is very accurate and precise and useful for one group may not be for the other. So I took this challenge on, and started to think, what could we say that is universal about systems change when I get asked to evaluate? So here's a couple of things. Number one, key features of a system. Who's seen this diagram before? Okay, not too many. Okay, well, it may have been like a biology class or something. This is from Lankelly Chase out of the UK. It's a pretty common framing of systems, and just hold on to a bit. It says the basic features of a system are that they have boundaries, geographic and domain boundaries. I'm dealing with the education system in Logan, right? And it's got cross-scale dynamics. There's a school, there's Logan, there's the state or the school board, etc. It's got agents and actors. Who are all the players in this system? And they are in some kind of relationship, tight, loose, hierarchical, not. And this is basic when people say map your system. Remember Donna's quote earlier about the healthcare system? They would have said start mapping it. What scale, what domain, etc. Now, that's the starting point. I'm going to go to the next one. Oop. Oh, I don't think I have my video. Who remembers the Wolf's Change Rivers video? Okay, it's not on here, so now I'm in real time, not able to show you a video, but it was on earlier. Let's just recreate what happens. They reintroduce wolves into the Yellowstone National Park, right? And what happens after that? It's called a trophic cascade. That input creates a splatter of self-refueling change processes. The wolves get rid of the bears, and then they get rid of the deers, and the bears start showing up, and the berries start growing, and then the otters come in. What happens is they unlock a system that was in inertia by simply introducing a new species, and the refueling effects go on and on and go on. This leads to this, leads to this, leads to that. So much so that at one point, the effects are so big and so cumulative that the boundaries of the rivers begin to change. They meander less. And the reason is because the soil, because there's more trees, erodes less. and the banks stabilize, and they actually change the structure of the rivers. Now, this is interesting for a whole bunch of reasons, including if we would just let the planet heal itself, it probably could. But here's some other dimensions of this. Is Yellowstone National Park, i.e. your system, closed or is it open? You're dealing with health, education in Logan, for example. You're dealing with the overlapping system, the land use system, the transportation planning system, the employment system, etc. Number one. Number two, it's emergent behavior. When you're dealing with the system, the outcomes are the result of everyone interacting with each other. It's not just what the teachers are doing, it's what everyone is doing that cumulatively leads to those outcomes. So no one actor can impose a solution on their own, it's a cumulative effect. Hey, you have a food system in Brisbane, right? The food system. How many actors are there in the food system in Brisbane? Well, at least 2.5 million consumers. They're all actors. There's health inspectors, there's suppliers, there's transportation people, etc. Look at all the players that interact with this food system. So you're worrying about the price of fruit. It's a cumulative effect of all those things interacting together. So that's important later on. Nonlinear dynamics. Anyone ever push hard on a systems change where you pushed and nothing happened? Yeah? That's nonlinear. Effort does not equal outcome. The case of the wolf shows just a little input. A pack of wolves creates a disproportionately large outcome. So the dynamics are nonlinear. You can't really do an easy logic model for systems change. Number three, varying levels of predictability, and they're ever evolving. It's really hard to estimate what happens. When you intervene into a complex issue, it generates a splatter of outcomes. Some of which are intended, some of which are not, and even if you do eventually get to predict some, the system keeps moving on you. Now, if you ever have a chance of how wolves change rivers, take a look at that, because it's a metaphor that I want you to hold on to as we get into the next pieces here. This was big for me because we're going to, sorry folks, one slide's not showing up, another one's not showing. Who's ever seen the triangle here on the bottom, the upside down triangle? This is from FSG, Foundation Strategy Group, the people who really popularized the phrase collective impact. And they actually took something from Donella Meadows and other systems thinker, and they said, when you look at systems change, it actually, they say they've distilled it into 6 conditions of change. And I'm going to say this is inaccurate, but it's useful. And it's inaccurate because all models are inaccurate. All frameworks are inaccurate. They reveal things and they distort things. But this one is really revealing of some basic things around conditions for change. And here's what they say. Simplification, but still useful. The stuff on the surface around systems, things, conditions, or drivers of, or leverage points for change include policies, practices, and resource flows. So we could push on those and say maybe we could see some different outcomes. They say, go underneath the surface, it's a bit semi-explicit, is some other dynamics that equally influence those conditions change, if not more. Connections and relationships and power and authority. If you can change the power and authority, i.e. delegate responsibility for education to lower levels, or increase relationships, make sure service providers talk together better and coordinate services, etc., you can get bigger outcomes. And finally, they say, all systems are held in place by mental models. So we are a prisoner back home of a European way of thinking about education. It's very Eurocentric, right? And if you're Indigenous community, particularly around kids in care, boy, oh boy, talk about a different worldview. In fact, I was in social services at one point, and an Indigenous elder says, Mark, you know how we keep getting dinged for being bad parents because our kids aren't at home? And in a First Nations community in Cree in northern Alberta, when we were all living in teepees next to each other, the moment a kid got 12 or 13 years old and we started irritating each other, anyone have 12 or 13-year-old kids, they would just go live with their uncles and aunties 2 or 3 tents over. And it's expected that your kid is kind of got 4 sets of parents for 4 or 5 years. She goes, but your worldview can't see that and you punish us for ours, and we look diminished in your eyes. So you can understand the role of mental models. Now, what I love about that, that's a beautiful distillation of things, but here's the issue. Have you ever seen moving a leverage point, a driver, and it not leading to any behavior change? The system actors keep doing what they're doing. Change of policy, everyone keeps, it's the same behavior. Have you not seen that? Yeah, in the case of the wolf, there was tons of behavior change. The animals started interacting with each other. That's what's so powerful about that video. But sometimes you can push and nothing happens. So we might change a policy, a set of service coordination, et cetera, but does it lead to behavior change on one or more actors? That's the second one. The third one is, are there enough behavior changes happening that we change the overall pattern of behavior in a system? Now in Yellowstone National Park we did. The overall pattern of behavior changed. The dosage was big enough, it was nonlinear, there was a predatory species put in there, it created a cascading effect. There was behavior change. But when we talk about systems change, we have to think about at least these three things. Did we change a driver? Is anyone changing behavior? And is the overall pattern of behavior changing? Now I'm going to show you some case studies of that. Is this feeling okay? Okay. Oh, there we go. So change of policy, does it change a behavior? And here's my beautiful diagram that I'm not going to show you now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit with this by saying, one day I was asked by Tamarack to hurry up and produce a paper. And so I went, I don't smoke, but I used to. So whenever I get stressed, I pretend I smoke again. I go, a paper? What the heck am I going to write on? I thought, I'm going to take Donna Podum's quote, the one about the healthcare system not knowing, as a kick in the butt and saying, how, if I'm on stage in 10 minutes, how would I start thinking about change? So there's three levels of change, saying, here's my wide angle lens. Number one, systems change, we just talked about it. Is this initiative changing drivers, or there's behavior change, and is the overall system behaving differently? Number one. Number two, what's the impact of that? Programmatic impact from a program and services. Targeted impact, is it happening in a suburb, even though we can't get the whole population level? And finally, population level outcome, three different scales. And the third one is, what are we learning about this issue that can inform the next iteration of strategy? And the reason I want to talk about that is because that's the only thing we control in systems change. You don't understand a system until you start mucking around with it. Interacting, and your ability to be really thoughtful and strategic and get insight to inform the next iteration is the predictor of success or failure. When you're doing systems change, all you have is an opening move. You start, and then you act, react, interact. Anyone ever play chess? Yeah, that's a closed game. It's a finite game. Two players, clear rules, clear endpoint. We work in infinite games when we're doing systems change. Lots of rules, players come and go, and it's never clear when we've won, if at all. We can check progress. So if you were playing chess even, you wouldn't plan 30 moves in advance, would you? No, so why would we in infinite games like systems change? You plan a couple moves in advance and you act, react, adapt. And as you learn more about the games and the players and the shifting sands, you make bigger bets. So strategic learning is mission critical and it's too often diminished and it's the only thing we control, so I think it should be central. Let me give you a couple examples of this. Case study, ending homelessness in Medicine Hat, Alberta. I'm going to go fairly quickly through these because all I want to do is to say, here's how the framework can organize our thinking about what constitutes a systems change. And this one's going to focus mostly on this big idea of Housing First. And I've done a bit of research. I know Housing First is in Brisbane. How many people are familiar with Housing First? About a third of the group. So what's the basic idea? There's a typical ladder in traditional housing, which is if you can manage some of your vulnerabilities over time, like excessive use of certain substances, etc., we will get you better housing. But it's like a salmon swimming upstream because you have to kind of win and earn the next level of housing. So it's quite a journey. Housing First says, for two reasons, forget about it. For social justice reasons, you should be in a house, number one. And number two, if you're in a home that's relatively stable, you'll have a better chance of dealing with those vulnerabilities. This kind of makes sense. There's lots of limits with this strategy, and I'm not going to get them into them today, so I'm not proposing this, but it's a useful way to think about systems change. So here's a quick example. I'm going to go through a couple of these conditions and talk about how the evaluation implications of that, because here's the challenge again. There's a million tools and techniques out there, when to use them. So policy change, anyone ever evaluate their advocacy efforts? There's tons of stuff out there. One of the most minor of the 24 policy changes required in Alberta to enable place-based approaches to homelessness includes simple adjusting the way government services require ID. You must have that here. Low-lying fruit, relatively. So what happens? This group in Medicine Hat, Alberta, had to track, along with their coalition partners, how they were pressing the government to let up on this. And that eventually it made it into the Alberta plan. So number one, let's look at the policies. Method number one, Harvard Family Research Project Advocacy Toolkit. We used that. We tracked the development of a policy over a continuum over time. Not policy impact, but policy. Could we develop a proposal for it? Number one. Ever try and develop a proposal with diverse partners? It's a workout. It's a workout, but you can do it. Get it placed on the agenda, get it adopted, get it implemented, get it maintained, and get it upgraded. I worked with a group in Calgary around fair fares for persons with social assistance getting access to public transit. We went around that circle 3 times in 12 years. Defend, upgrade, defend, upgrade. So we could track some kind of progress on that. Number two, if you want to say, yeah, well, that's pretty high level tracking of policy change, you can actually go even a little bit deeper in saying, are we creating the conditions for the policy change to happen? And if you want to look at another resource, the Centre for Evaluation Innovation has this great resource, 10 Pathways to Policy Change, each with their own theory of change, each with their own outcomes and each with their own indicators. So imagine how many of you are theory of change junkies, right? Someone's done a little bit of heavy lifting for us, so you just go there and you adapt it. This gives you the intermediate progress. Number three, when you get really close to policy change, you can start asking deeper questions when you're tracking policymakers. And the US does this because the Americans are way better at it than the Aussies and the Canadians, because they've had to do advocacy work for much longer because they're dealing with more stuff than we are, I would argue. They've got these ways of rating policymakers on city council, in the civil service, et cetera, about where they stand on policy issues, and they track them like crazy. So I'm not proposing these techniques, everyone. I'm just saying when you zoom out on policy change, we have a field thick with techniques, and policy change is but one driver. Now, if you take a look at relationships and connections, that's even deeper. How many of you have used social network analysis before? Some of you have. It's very interesting, so you have to be really clear why you're doing it, because you can have so much fun just doing this connectivity stuff, but it's really important to know why you're doing it. But in the case of Medicine Hat, they did a research study, and this isn't the one they did, but the findings were similar, so I used it. They did pre and post, and they found just within the network of people, clients and family and service providers, 2 interesting findings. Quantitative results, a reduction in network size over years. So people get into homes and their network collapses. Would that be bad? Maybe. However, it increases in density and frequency of contact. So it collapses, but it gets tighter. And then what happens, it starts moving away, and they call it network decay, I think, which was interesting. Demonstrated a strengthening of the quality relationships with family and housing providers and a shedding of burdensome and abusive relationships. These suggest something called network decay. The old networks are decaying as the new ones are being created. Now, this has been contested because I saw some other research, people saying even the old social capital is better than no social capital, so don't diminish those networks. So it's contested. But they kept going with this analysis, and they found out that the clients were networking fine, but we were still having problems networking and coordinating among service providers. People were competing for clients, and they really had tension about doing collaborative relationships going forward. So transformational changes almost for clients, unevenly successful changes for service providers. So are we changing systems? Not so much on the wraparound, not as big as we thought we might be having. So interesting insight. I'm going to go one more, mental models. Big one, how do you track the evolution of mental models? Well, here's one of my favorite techniques, Bellwether Evaluation. Bellwether Evaluation is you spot someone who represents a constituency or an influential group, not only represents but might influence, that you're trying to change. Top 100. And you track their actions, their behaviors, and their comments over time as a bellwether about whether mental models are shifting in key circles of influence. So many of you have seen this before. It's a great diagram, isn't it? If you're American, you know that Ohio is now is a bellwether for who's going to win the presidency. Doesn't mean it's a predictor, just means watch. They're probably going to tell you where the trend is going. Again, bellwether can also not only track people who represent trends, but they can try and influence people who influence other groups. So there's lots of geeky questions to ask here, and these ones are taken from bellwethers for policymakers, so kind of like these rating scales. What's the issue? How do you know about it? Where do you think it's on the agenda? How is it important to you? These are just sample questions. You could use any questions. But the bellwether that worked the most in Medicine Hat was the mayor. The mayor was pretty Canadian prairie populist conservatism, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of fella, and got involved in Housing First, where he said, I never thought it was possible, but with Housing First it was. I'm converted. In the old days, here's what we did. In the new format, here's what we did. His statements over a 5-year period are nothing short of absolutely remarkable. He influenced the Chamber of Commerce, the Rural Economic Development Council, etc. The number of people that he then influenced because they worked him like crazy to get him involved in Housing First is an indicator of systems change. Now, so we changed those systems. We actually had behavior changes when you look across all the evaluations, and they certainly tipped the overall behavior of the system, including to the point where Medicine Hat is now functionally, there's no more chronic homelessness. If you're caught homeless in Medicine Hat, if you avail yourself to the services, within 7 days you have a house with wraparound supports. Pretty amazing, eh? 2 years, they got other problems. The game is not over, but at least they achieved something there. Okay, so that's just policy stuff. Does it make sense? Zoom in on specific drivers that are initiative specific, and there's lots of tools and techniques to track progress. And why are we tracking progress? Because we're trying to get population level outcomes. The route is through systems change. So are we moving conditions or leverage points? Let's actually talk about increasing access to post-secondary education in Winnipeg's North End. Winnipeg's North End, pretty rough town. It's kind of like Chicago, Canada's little Chicago. In fact, Chicago's North End is tough, so is Winnipeg's North End. Heavy Indigenous First Nation, and Winnipeg is very organized with First Nations communities. The biggest urban Aboriginal population in Canada, 75,000. And very committed to reconciliation. So they actually have a 6-year strategy using human-centered design, collective impact, and others to say neighbors are going to renew Point Douglas, and we're going to do it from an Indigenous lens. Now, what's interesting is one of their projects has to do with getting kids pumped for high school graduation and access to university. And so one of their early wins, someone in Adelaide called this a pudgy bunny. You guys call it that? No early wins, low-lying fruit, pudgy bunny. Apparently you can catch a pudgy bunny. That's what they... That's an Adelaide thing. It's the Canada Learning Bond. Now, do you have these learning bonds where you get government top-up to save for post-secondary? So it's a government program that's out there, but the government can't exploit it. They're having trouble getting people to take up this learning bond. And the learning bond is quite modest in size. But the research around savings programs shows it's not just the money, it's getting you thinking about the future. We're getting you with some level of intentionality to think about post-secondary education. So the early studies show that it looks pretty good that if you got learning bonds, you're likely to increase the likelihood of people doing well at school and going to post-secondary. The problem is uptake is low. Okay, so this was their organizing effort. And they went through a 5-year process simply to get people to take up the learning bond. And I picked this example explicitly because it's not, someone would say it's not rocket surgery. Rocket science, brain surgery, get it? Okay, it's pretty straightforward. So what does it take to even work on something this straightforward? So here was their strategy. Winnipeg Boldness is the convener. They have a dump load of partners. I'm not even going to tell you what they all did, but they're engaging a lot of people. Their phrase was, anyone who's not moving, we're going to get in their way. We want everyone to be moving on this. They have their strategies around enrollment, identification, accessible banking, children in care, and post-enrollment, and they have systems change and population level results. Okay, that's their strategy. Let me introduce a very cool methodology that helps track the unfolding of that strategy. and that's outcome harvesting. Anyone hear of outcome harvesting? Yeah, I love it. It's the most elegant thing you can do from 30,000 feet. And what it says is when you look at complex change initiatives, they really are all about an accumulation of behavior changes by key system actors, right? That's outcomes. They contribute to an impact. In this case, it's going to be sign up for the post-secondary bond. But you need behavior changes by system actors. And when we assess that, we have to assess the significance of those changes, why they're important, those behavior changes, and to what degree did we as the change makers contribute to their change. If you're a backbone organization, you're not running the show, you're behind the scenes, so we contribute to that change. Now, here's an example of Toronto. Toronto has something called the Toronto Renewal Housing Corporation, Renewal project, and they have 2,000 towers in Toronto that were built between 1950 and 1970 that are terrible for energy, GHG emissions. They're not multifunctional and they're disconnected from transit. The problem is you can't tear them down because they hold at least 1 million Torontonians, and they're the biggest absorption housing stock for new Canadians coming to Toronto, and 55% of people who are in Toronto now are born outside the country, right? So strategic stock. So the idea is how do you renew the stock in a way that deals with energy, carbon emissions, reconnects them to transit, and creates multifunctional nodes. Now, big project, lots of money involved in housing. This group has a whole bunch of things going on around public education, policy nudges, demonstration projects, etc., to get the field aligned to dealing something like this. You can't manage that from the center. There's too many moving pieces. So here is an outcome, one outcome. 2016, the Toronto City Housing Corporation and the Toronto Atmospherics Fund launched a joint project to invest $4.2 million into 7 retrofits. That's a behavior change. Would you agree? There's some GHG stuff happening, but that's a behavior change. That's important. Big housing owner and big investor are trying something. They're aligned with our mission. The project is learning rich, and we get some utility savings and 30% reduction in GHG emissions. But here's why that's significant. This is an evaluation question. Numbers by themselves don't mean anything. We have to ask why that outcome is significant. They have 2,200 units. So if they catch religion on this project, think of the scalability. This isn't just another housing provider. They're the largest owner of social housing in North America. So getting them in your engage is pretty significant. So we asked about the contribution, and the contribution was, hey, we probably wouldn't have done this in the same way or even at all had there not been the Toronto region, had there not been this partnership. You nudged us into that direction and you shaped our delivery process, so they give us a high contribution. This is a little vignette of a long-term journey towards systems change. Now, I'm going to give you an example or two that shows you what this looks like when you zoom out. Here's a project in Burundi, just developing capacity for public sector reform. This is taken from a World Bank site, World Bank report. Look at all those little bubbles. You don't even have to know what's in them. All of them are little behavior changes. This happened, and each of them could be a story like this, folks. One bubble could be that. You want to zoom in? Story upon story, this led to that, and they've combined them by leadership and priority setting, policy changes, public sector delivery reforms. It's the accumulation of things, everyone, that leads to big moments of change. And when we're in the field of social innovation, we're always looking for the big knockout punch. We did it, boom. But we don't have the patience to handle all the tactical things required to get there. Change accumulates over time. And it's the accumulation of little things that leads to big moments. So here's another example. Solid waste management in reform in Bosnia. Bubble, bubble, bubble. This leads to that. That leads to this. This is terrific because you don't even need a theory of change to track this. You're tracking something as it emerges and unfolds. It doesn't even have to fit nicely into a strategy. This is how change happens, folks. There are steps here that I'm not really going to touch on too much, which is review documentation. Matthew, pretend you were going to be tracking some of your policy change. What you and your team would do was you would start down and saying, here's what we think all of our little outcome statements are and how. You'd produce them and you might put them in little bubbles. Then you go to your stakeholders and with hunched shoulders, you go, what do you think? And you're evoking a response because guess what? They're going to think something. They're going to go, what the hell? You didn't get that right. Well, what about this? You forgot about this. You're challenging them to fix up the outcome story. And they're going to say, you forgot about this and you forgot about that. So you're evoking a response. Hopefully the stories you get back are twice as good because you got 360-degree intelligence on this. Then if you said, we have some high-stake claims here in some of these stories, and we might be drinking our own Kool-Aid on this, let's actually get verification and substantiation from third parties who know about that story, and they can tell us whether it really unfolded like that. Is this making sense? This is interesting because rather than have to be perfect about this, what we're trying to get is roughly right, reasonable approximation of what happened when and who is involved and how is significant. So we're not trying to prove a model to get scaled. We're trying to get multiple stakeholders to track and make sense of an unfolding change process. Now, the reason I want to show you that is this is where this group in Winnipeg is. Here's their outcome harvest by their five or different streams of strategy. Different times, different bubbles, big things happened. Now, when we zoom out and saying, let's look a little bit more deeply into all these little accumulative changes they are claiming, we have some interesting things, operational changes. The development and delivery of workshops to train local organizations on how to build awareness and increase uptake in the CLB in the North End. I forgot what the numbers were, but it was something like 25. So they put these workshops out. They organized them. They're taking a high contribution. And why was that significant? Expands the number of variety of people in Winnipeg's North End who are on top of this topic. And in fact, they have stats here about how many people came to their workshops. So boom, that's an outcome. Postnatal engagement pilot, two hospitals developed a pilot to address errors in birth registration because this had been identified as a barrier to obtaining primary identification. Boom, they're trying that out. We don't have to love these folks. I don't even really understand this issue. But what they're doing is trying to say, here are little things that happen on the way to the big things. Provincial government ID pilot, they influenced the provincial government. It even goes into policy and investment changes. Look at this one, number 5. Direct billing practices extended across the province, that's pretty big. ESDC Investments agrees to invest $12.5 million. That's resource flows, right? Aren't any of these by themselves huge? I don't know, probably not. But again, it's the accumulation of those little things. So here's what happens when you look at all those systems changes, all of which we could have talked about here, and see what the outcomes were. So outcomes for individuals or programmatic interventions, 630 persons directly signed up to the Canada Learning Bond through those delivery agents. This is a neighborhood of about 10,000 people. Targeted, anecdotal evidence of increased uptake in First Nations communities. We don't have evidence, we're scared. Now we went, what the heck, how did we not capture this? So we got to go look for targeted evidence. Here's population level evidence. The sign-up rate for CLB increased in Point Douglas at 65% a greater rate than in larger Winnipeg rating and 2 times the Canadian average. Everyone's hustling on the CLB, but Point Douglas is making more progress faster than anyone else. So we know we have a population level impact just on the uptake. We still, as you know, have questions about downstream education. Outcome harvesting is a 30,000-foot executive summary of the unfolding of a systems change over time. It allows for the messy accumulation of that data and to help social innovators and their supporters get a roughly right sense of are they making progress on their big ambitious goals. Going to finish with this third one and then let you chat. So the plot line again, are we moving drivers, seeing behavior changes? Is that translating into people outcomes of some kind of order and scale? The third one is strategic learning. What are we learning when we engage in a system and get strategic intelligence about the nature of the problem, the conditions that keep it in place, and our own ability to make change? So, racism in Edmonton, we have racism. And this is considered a fundamental cause of a lot of the inequities in Northern Alberta. So one group took on a racism lab, how to use human-centered design to uncover what generates racialized behavior and create little prototypes to help people who might be experiencing racism, particularly persons of color, getting housing in Edmonton. So they have this thing called the Shift Lab, and many of you have your own human-centered design process. This is just a variation on the theme, ethnographic research, brainstorming, rapid prototypes, field prototypes, and then if you find something that works, you go look for people to adopt and scale. We're going to talk more about this tomorrow. Feeling it? So they pull the group together and they get some pretty interesting prototypes. They go through a round of it. They have 25 people that meet for 4 months and they come up with 3 prototypes, all of which have been adopted since, right? They've been sustained. One is mobile legal aid. If you're experiencing a challenge with a landlord who you feel is breaking the law, you make this call and people zoom out to you in a van with lawyers, etc., and they go, here are your options. We're gonna go toe-to-toe with this tenant, with this landlord. Pretty aggressive. Someone funded that, believe it or not. Pretty cool. Number 2, diversity certification program for housing suppliers. This is to say, you want to be a housing supplier of choice, come take our diversity training, and we'll tell you what it's like for different cultures to be involved in housing, including simple things like if you're in Northern Alberta and you have Indigenous people staying in your place, they often do smudging. And I just learned smudging is not big here. Smudging is where you take sweetgrass and you smoke it and it's like a prayer. And if we were at a meeting, we would start with the smudge and you would cleanse your head, your mind, your ears, your eyes, your heart, and your whole body, and then you would proceed. It's like a meditation. It's not racially motivated, but it has a racialized outcome that most tenants saying you can't smoke smudge in your apartment. Fire code. It's just European neurosis about that stuff. So they're saying, here's what it's like, and this is a tradition, and it's actually, here's how it doesn't actually affect fire code. So imagine someone goes through that, you get the stamp of approval, and when the boom is on in Alberta, and it goes up and down all the time, and it's off, you want to attract people to your apartment. So this program has taken off. The final one is, you have NIMBY here? So they said, let's get YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. And they have this whole thing about engaging neighborhoods with data to show that housing prices don't go down and safety isn't an issue, et cetera, because they're bringing evidence to bear to say most of these things are myths. So, folks, the reason I like these is they're all terrific, but the conclusion was none of these is going to have much in the way of programmatic impact for a while, and their dosage is not big enough to have targeted or population level impact. Why the hell not? So they went through the strategic learning thing using a method called triple loop learning. Many of you have used this with reflective practice. And they said, here's our result, unsatisfactory. Is it because of what we're doing, what we're thinking, or how we're being? Now, here's what they found out. They have 11 key insights about the strengths and limitations of their own workshop design. There was 11 tactical things they could have improved upon. We've all done workshops. We know what those are like, right? Not as long, different facilitators, etc. Thinking, 8 insights about the nature of racism and poverty in Edmonton, including racism can be internalized, interpersonal, and systemic, the different manifestations of racism. We learned a lot, the group. Including 3 insights about our lab methodology, which included the lab stuff is great, but it causes real friction with people who have a social justice stance, who think that's incrementalism, managerial, and it avoids the root cause. So we had a big blow up in the lab about that. The final one was the most important. We struggle to have deeper, meaningful conversations about race. We always play Canadian nice. The moment someone feels a bit of tension, we kind of back off. I used this phrase the other day. Why did the Canadian chicken cross the road? To get to the middle. Okay? We're not good at it. In fact, Canada's politeness, and when some anthropologists did this, because we had such crazy diversity earlier on, it's like WD-40. It's meant to be the grease that allows for lots of interaction between different cultures, but it's got a dark side. It means it's hard to go deep on stuff. So here's what we did. We used something called Theory U to interpret that, and some people have used Theory U. How many people have used it? Otto Scharmer, et cetera. What it says is if you want to actually get on the other side of something to see transformational change, you have to actually go on a journey that goes downward, where you uncouple your thoughts and your sense of what you think the problem is. You get tested, you even get battered a little bit, to the point where you hit the bottom of the U, where you're kind of open, right? You've deconstructed yourself a little bit. And then you're open to new ways of seeing things. Now, this is actually a constant process, but they said, when you look at the Theory U, when we try and understand what we did, it offers a lot of insight from a reflective practice point of view, including 4 types of conversations. Level 1, talking nice. Level 2, talking tough, debating. Level 3, reflexive dialogue. And level 4, generative dialogue. And here's what we found. We were always talking nice. Someone would say something about racism, someone else would get a little bit perturbed, and there would be a little bit of tension in the room, and we'd back off, and we never entertained any of it. People in the post-review said, I brought 5% of myself to this. I was so scared of saying anything for fear of getting contested or unleashing something we couldn't stop that we'd even talk. We never even got to talking tough. And one fellow actually stood up and says, I don't have a position. I have some perspectives that I'm willing to get on the other side of, but I can't do that without dialogue. Like, how am I supposed to get on the other side of it? I can't, you've asked me to stay inside. I don't know if I believe this. It's my opening move. So then, reflexive dialogue, Matthew, let's say you and I were arguing about something. The reflexive dialogue is, what is Matthew trying to say? I've given up trying to communicate my own stuff, and I've given up, I've suspended that, and saying, how does he see this issue? And I need insight and empathy into his experience and his worldview. Because if we can do that, we can get to generative dialogue. Folks, this sounds soft, but it's hard. This was the hardest lab I've ever evaluated, the most exciting, because they were the ones that took this on seriously. And so here's what they said. Because we did this, we mostly stayed here. We did not go deep enough in our interventions, and therefore we had a very shallow U. Our prototypes are interesting, but they're incremental. They're not big enough or profound enough to have any kind of impact. So if we want impact, we have to go to Shift Lab 2.0. And Shift Lab 2.0 was to support the evolution of the original 3 and a strong emphasis on developing capacity for incredibly tough conversations in Edmonton. So here are the 3 speakers we brought simply to shake up the Edmonton environment. Shelley Tulloch from Los Angeles, Witnessing Whiteness, the need to talk about race and how to do it. She said, she called everyone a whitey, because if you're whitey, here's your problem. And she really delved into it. It was really quite anxiety-inducing, actually, but it was really good. So she gave us all these tools and tips. Just cracked, disrupted, normalized, socialized something. Then we brought Daryl Davis, who's a blues musician. Has anyone heard of Dale? Dale converts Ku Klux Klan members. He goes and says, I'd rather talk with you than fight with you. And he spends time with them. He's on the news. Check him on YouTube. He's a real personality. And he's collected 18 robes of people who've thrown in the robes after spending time with them. And he talks about what it's like to be fierce in these conversations and normalize that for us. So many people should know Trevor Phillips. Anyone know Trevor? No? UK Diversity Czar under Tony Blair. They ran a campaign that dealt with racism in England, but they focused on diversity. And he talked about all the things not to do. Just saying, you think you're doing the right thing, but you're going to get counterproductive results, including having signs saying, here's a brain from Africa, here's a brain from Asia, and they're all the same size. We caught such hell for that. Because what we did is we diminished people, we threatened them, and then they got repressed, and that repression showed up in very odd ways and inappropriate ways all over the place. Because we would never do that again. So what I love about this, he's not giving solutions, but they're now creating a container for us to talk about this stuff where Canadians have a real hard time talking about it. I won't tell you much about Shift Lab 2.0 because the evaluation is being done right now. It's way better than 1.0, and it's partly because of this. So folks, that's just a way of organizing thinking about when we're tackling complex issues where systems change is the heart of it. We could easily default to traditional logic models and quants and comparison group designs on discrete interventions. That's not what systems change is. The unit of analysis is the system. The intervention is emergent. There are multiple factors playing out. It unfolds in a messy way over time, hopefully clumsily off in the right direction. So how does one start asking questions that then leads us to the methods that we could use to begin to create a coherent picture of what the heck is going on? So this is what we chatted about. Why? Systems change, what does it look like? How to evaluate system change? And so what are the implications for you? These 3 examples each reveal something different about this framework. But now what we're going to do with a little bit of time, perfect timing, is turn it over to you for just about 5 minutes, if you don't mind, because we have 15 minutes for conversations. It's 10 after. What insights emerge for you from this framework? What might some of the implications be for your own work? May not be any. And then we'll take some questions for the field for 15 minutes. Okay? Have a go at it, 5 minutes in pairs or triads. Just have a conversation, then we'll open it up in 5. Hey, sister.
I know, check it out. I just want a PRS cab charge cars to get a cab from that thing.
Is that right? Are you close enough to take a cab? I mean, no.
From home.
Do you want to say something, or do you want me just to grab?
Yeah, when you get the questions.
Like, all right, everyone. So just before we begin, I want to just replay this metaphor thing about frameworks. And I mentioned it earlier, but I'm going to mention it again. All frameworks try and do is create coherency out of messiness. And frameworks are all inaccurate because they can't handle the complexity of the work, but they are useful if they reveal something, even if they distort and miss other things. So frameworks are like throwing on a set of glasses, and you'd say, what do I see with these sets of glasses? Let me put on another set of glasses. So the challenge is, does this framework reveal anything to you about your work, and does it generate new questions, knowing that it's not the only framework that you could use? In fact, when you really get into it, there's frameworks around integrated service delivery that talk about what reformed services look like that are a lot more granular, that might reveal more because they're a lot more granular, but wouldn't tell you much about how to deal with racism, right, on systems change. So let's just open it up. See, we have a microphone here. Yeah, if people have questions or observations, let's see if we can react to this a little bit. And even if you're quite offended by the framework, I'm okay with that too, because all we're trying to do is try and get better and more coherent about talking about and evaluating systems change. So let's have a go at it. Any hands up? Nope. Oh, we have one here. Thank you. Yep, we have a...
Thanks. Jason Reed from United Care in Central Queensland. We talked about it, it's been a reflection for some time, I guess, is we feel it makes a difference with the size of the organisation, and that if we're looking, really what we're talking about is a culture shift, when we identify that when there's a different person around the table, the conversation's different, and you might get some energy and some momentum and 3 steps forward, and that person moves on, and a new person comes to the table, and there's 2 steps back.
Yeah.
So our reflection, I guess, more of our challenge, more of a flag in the ground to say who's going to come with us on this journey is how on earth do we shift our organisations as a whole, but shift government as a whole?
Yeah.
Easy one for you.
Yeah. Well, and I could take the Fifth Amendment and say I want to just talk about evaluation, but I couldn't allow myself to do that given I said evaluation's a backdoor to strategy. So there's a fellow in a team in Vancouver, Alet Mansky and Vicky Kamak, and they're very big in the area around the world of disabilities and have done really innovative stuff around things like, they were one of the first groups in the world to create an online platform called Ties, where if you had a person with disability, they're concerned about their kids outliving them. They said it's the first time kind of in human history when your children with disabilities could outlive you. So they're preoccupied with this, and they've created lots of organizations and started creating social networks for the kids. So they have sort of a Facebook page. It's now pretty common for persons with disability. They then pushed for the RDSP, which is kind of like the Canada Learning Bond, except it's a matching program that you can put in and the government tops up and you don't get taxed, creating an asset base for your kids. They've just come out with a book called The Superhero Skill, Persons with Disabilities, and looking throughout history about kids with disabilities and trying to reframe the conversation around living a good life. So they're pretty powerful. And their secret, they said, was how do we act like an organization but think like a movement? And so they've always done that. So what they do is they say, well, we have programs and services and we have lots of service delivery options, but that's simply a mechanism for movement building. So everything they do, how do they build a movement? How do they create networks of civil service leaders that care? And so in British Columbia, they wouldn't just meet with one, they would meet with networks of people, knowing that people are going to start popping around all over the place in any event. They think about media, how do you get ideas into the water supply. In fact, they made it a point to work with unusual suspects. So that RDSP, that savings program I told you about, that was launched with fervor under Canada's most conservative government in 30 years. And because Joe Flaherty's son Tim Flaherty's son had a disability, and they connected with someone, an unusual suspect, and got him so engaged in it that he pushed it through a conservative agenda. So they think like movement builders, and like any movement builder, you're trying to change the ground under which everyday politics are placed, and you're playing a long game where you do it because it's a vocation. And you do it because windows open and close, but if you have the networks and the movement going, you have the opportunity to run through them. So kind of like living life with bifocals, I guess. Long term and a short term. Thanks. Tough question. Whew. Had to start with that one. Let's do a couple more, folks. We're not getting out of here unless we get 3 or 4 or 5 different questions. Who felt something was revealed to them about their own work in this? Like thinking, oh, I kind of can see it slightly differently now because of the framework. A couple people? Yep. Oh.
Hey, Mark, I think I've asked you this question or version of this before, but definitely provoked by what you said this morning. Just a little bit on where you see the role of the evaluators as part of the change,
Yeah.
or independent of the change, and that whole world of partiality, subjectivity, objectivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think we might have talked about it in the Tower of Power a couple years ago. 2 things. First of all, we chatted about this in Canberra the other day. I want to make a big point about evaluation as something that needs to be upside down. Evaluation started off as reality testing for social innovators, and over time it evolved into an accountability process to external partners. So people often think, I'm doing this for someone else, how do I prove to someone else? I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but what I would like to do is revert to how this whole thing started, which is to say the social innovators have to be the hungriest for real-time feedback of anybody, and they want information like this in order to make the next adaptation to strategy. And I don't think we do that enough, because people go, what does someone else need? What do we need? We should be the most demanding kids on the block around evaluative feedback. And if we do our job for ourselves, we should have a relatively easier time meeting external accountability requirements and dealing with the marketing and promotion that comes with that. So I think we have to return to the start. We are the primary users. Other people will come, but the better we are for us, the easier it will be for others. Now, what that means is, if you're going to be doing this in real time as an innovator, you probably should have evaluation embedded as a function, rather than as a periodic visit from someone from the outside. And there's a lot of boundary management issues in that around subjectivity and bias, and we've mentioned that, and I experience them myself. That is my biggest challenge being a developmental evaluator. I really start to like the groups I'm working with and get caught up with their process. That has to be dealt with, and I deal with it in the following way, which is my job is reality testing. My big purpose is to help people get real good data, real-time feedback, and good sense making. But that problem is better to have than the problem of having someone come in from the outside that is external, but is decontextualized, arrives late, and is dealing with a photocopy of reality. Now, we need externals from time to time, but I'd rather have the inside problem, right, than the outside problem. Innovators need real-time feedback in a way that gives them the insight they need to make real-time decisions, not every once in a while external produced reports. I don't want to diminish the role of externals, but that is something that happens once in a while. It doesn't have to happen every day like a social innovator needs. There's a lot of stuff written on that, by the way. If you're interested in this, the Developmental Evaluation Principles and Practice book from 4 years ago really talks about boundary management for evaluators, but they essentially come to the same conclusion. Better to have that problem than the other one. Yep.
Sorry, just as a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
Mark, because even in this work, the innovative social change, long-term work, it's still where evaluation is resourced, it's still much more external than internal.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of challenges. We're dealing with an ecosystem that listen, I think we used this 2 years ago as well. We're dealing with 21st century problems with 19th century machinery. The systems we have right now are on trial, in my opinion. I just think that they're not coping with this stuff. So prove to me that the current management systems are useful. They're tight and coherent and rigid, but they're not enabling of adapting with complex issues. In fact, even little things like procurement for evaluation, where a traditional one would procure a report, right? Do you know how long it takes to write a report in an evaluation? I mean, it could take up to 40 to 50% of the budget. Literally, it can to write a good report. How many people read the full report? And usually, particularly if it's a summative report, it comes sometimes 24 months after the summative moment has happened. We already know what's going on, so it's a bit of a game. So there's lots of work to do on creating an ecosystem that's friendly to adaptive management and complex change initiatives, so we're mostly coping. Now, you can tell when people cope. I just did a quality assessment of a developmental evaluation at the UN, and they had tremendously good copers, people who knew their system well but could navigate it, including revising the deliverable schedule and moving money off of this year into that year's. It's exhausting, but we need heroes like that who know their system but can cope with it and do workarounds. Yeah, but we're clear. Listen, on the other hand, some groups are really good at it. The J.W. McConnell Foundation in Canada gives tons of money for evaluation. And when they get an external report, you know how long they want it to be? 2-3 pages. They just say, tell me everything that's not going well, because I know we invested in you. There's no accountability mechanism we can give to you that's going to make you more accountable, right? You're waking up at 2 in the morning thinking about this stuff. So there's lots of exemplars of people who do it the right way. Oh, another question. Oh. Let's do it. 1 or 2 more, folks. Oh, one over here.
Just a question about, I guess, systemic change when you've got so this is all messy and complex and nuanced and the slow game. But when you've got a media that is crisis-driven and scandal-driven,
yeah,
and how that intersects and how you do this work when you've got a media that's like pushing scandal and then wants swift action and decisive decisions when it's a much more nuanced, complex conversation.
Yeah, I wish we would have shut down the question period about 1 minute ago. Yeah, you put your finger on something pretty big. In fact, there's a big push on right now back home around something called solutions journalism, which there's lots of dimensions to it, but one of them was the media itself is too crisis-driven and in fact actually disables rather than enables people to navigate complex issues. So it's a fairly big issue. Yeah, I have no easy things to say except it needs to be done, and most people actually have to cope with those conditions in the same way they have to deal with inappropriate procurement conditions for developmental evaluation. You simply cope. I think I'll give you an example of my exemplar, though, and this is from Hamilton. Liz Weaver, many of you have met Liz Weaver. This is her backcountry. When they first started poverty reduction and collective impact, the Hamilton Spectator, they worked that Hamilton Spectator. Like they engaged them like they did the mayors, like all the major influencers. And the Hamilton Spectator came out 1 year at the beginning of their poverty reduction work, maybe 2005 or 6, and they had a blank page on their front cover. It's the first time in North America major newspapers had a blank page. And then they turn the page and they say, this is how much we know about people living in poverty in our community, and we are committed to making this change. And so what they did is they hired a poverty reporter who did beat work on poverty, and they did things like everyone does now. They called it Code Red. They did the postal code stuff and said, if you're in this neighborhood, you have the second highest quality of life in the world. If you're in this one, you're 137. Right, so they did all that stuff. They did reporting, etc., and they continued that for about 7 or 8 years to the point where their media commitment was one of the reasons that people assessed was one of the reasons that even 7 or 8 years later, poverty reduction was the #1 public priority for people in Hamilton for the municipal elections. Not the federal ones, not the state ones, for the municipal ones. It wasn't build a stadium, it wasn't fix the roads, it was all that. #1 was poverty reduction, and a lot of it was because of meaningful engagement of the media. So I don't know, how do you turn them into a partner rather than a consumer? Yeah, and that was, by the way, that was before social media, which I think complexifies like crazy.
That point's the one I want to ask about.
Oh, darn. I thought I slayed that one. No, it's a big one.
But, well, thinking particularly about social media, because one of the thoughts I've always had is, you go out and consult, you might hear from the usual suspects sort of thing, and yet you look at these social media platforms, and you seem to get, this mass sense of what is going on with behaviour. Now, I know there's this concept of digital self versus real self.
Yeah.
However, there's a lot to that also shows there's some pretty strong correlations as well.
Yep.
And so, because I was asking myself this question, how do we track system change efforts? So looking in that system change box, number 2, changes of behaviour of system actors. And I keep thinking, all right, Cambridge Analytica got a bit too much trouble for the way they did it. But why were they doing it? Clearly because it works.
Mm-hmm.
Look at who's President of the United States.
Yep.
So, these sorts of things, how do we better harness social media to better understand the systems change that's actually coming on?
Yeah. Well, there are people who are much better at that. In fact, if you Google it, you'll find it. But I'm going to give you another example of people turning the press not into from a client, but into an engaged partner, and that was the Energy Futures Lab in Alberta. So we're going to talk more about this tomorrow ever so briefly in one of the sessions. Alberta's like Western Australia. We have an oil and gas economy, and it's in a tailspin right now for a whole bunch of reasons. The Americans are energy independent. The Saudis are trying to squeeze out marginal producers, and the whole world is greening, right? So that model, this is where the oil sands are, is now in decline. And the messaging to get into the zeitgeist of Albertans is to try and create a new narrative that's less polarized, because right now the polarized narrative, including social media, is either drill baby drill or keep it in the ground, right? And so what they're saying is to be the third way in Alberta now is the middle is radical. That how can we create an energy system the future requires of us building on the leadership position that we have today. So it's designed to say we can make a third way transition. We're not going to fall into those two polarities. And they are really working hard at exemplars. They actually show case studies of people who were so polarized in their views now working on joint ventures together. So they're trying to get third way into the zeitgeist, into the water supply. And we tried to engage 3 different platforms, and we've only had success in one of them. One of them was engaging the Manning Institute, which is our most conservative think tank in Alberta, head of someone who created the Reform Party and who has an environmental bent. And no progress yet created a lot of engagement for him to come out with the climate change thing on third way, and he's about to retire. And the new leadership doesn't want to do it. So act like an organization, think like a movement. We were close to a win there and just missed it, but that's all you do is play odds in this work. Missed that. Number 2, then focused on the Calgary Herald, the business editorial team, which is pretty comfortable with the traditional oil and gas system, and tracked a woman named Deborah Yedlin and tried to engage her. We tracked her media for 6 years and looked at all her speeches and her content. She not only does not know, maybe not know, never mention us, she may go out of her way to avoid us. So, boom. Almost won. Finished on the second. The third one we tracked is June Warren Nichols, and we engaged them like crazy. They're a slightly progressive oil and gas a team that focuses on environmental transition, and they produce every 2 or 3 weeks a profile of the Energy Futures Lab exemplars and stories of the third way. So we can't command the system, but the system yields if you do your work, and we got 1 success, 1 almost, and 1 failure. Those odds are better than not trying. Right. Yeah.
One more question? We might have to close.
Hi. My name's Ruby. I work for an organisation that's probably a bit more like a backbone rather than direct service delivery. And a lot of the things that you presented, nearly all of them resonated to the work with the work that we do. I'm just wondering if there's a process, or you talked about starting and learning and adapting and all that, the process of looking at all of these things at once, or?
Yeah, it's good. You're asking a very practical question about how to start. You know what I'll do? There are some of these resources that I mentioned earlier about evaluating systems change. Have you ever heard about an evaluation scope of work? No, USA evaluation scope of work. United States Agency for International Development uses it quite a bit. I have adopted it. An evaluation scope of work is a mechanism to tell innovators to sit down and almost like saying, we're going to start a house reno and we don't want to work on the design, but what do we need to do? We need to fix the dining room and we probably have to have a back entrance. It asks a bunch of questions about how to scope out an evaluation. And it's pretty agnostic about whether it's a program or a systems change evaluation, but simply saying, what do you want to know when is really important. And the reason I think it's important is because if we had time, I would show you a video and I would ask you guys to do a little test. I would show you a video of Muhammad Yunus replicating microlending from Bangladesh to New York. And it's a 5-minute video, some of you have seen it, and I would say, please evaluate this in teams, and you guys would start evaluating it. You'd say, here are the indicators, here are the methods, oh, I like that framework. 8 minutes in, I would say, I sent you on a fool's errand, because we don't know who the users are, what questions do they have, when their windows of use are, and do they have preferences for how the data is gathered. Was it Muhammad Yunus saying, can I replicate this thing in North America? Was it the Ford Foundation saying, I want to see impact now? Was it the poor program administrator wondering how come people don't come on Thursday nights? Right? So an evaluation scope of work says don't be supply side in the evaluation, be demand side. And where you start depends on where your demand is. Then you'll know, at least say viscerally we need information on this policy change or that impact. So it's like a process guide that's really quite helpful. But I'll tell you what, I'll write a little memo as a follow-up saying, in addition to this PowerPoint, if you wanted to start, here are 3 or 4 ways you could, including an evaluation scope of work.
Awesome, thank you. That
Good.
would be most appreciated, I'm sure, Mark. Thank you so much. A round of applause.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. I'm sure for all of us there was some take-home messages in there and some more thinking to be done. From a QCOS perspective, as an organisation that is trying to think like a movement and create a movement for change, there are certainly some great learnings in there for us, particularly around, I think, the strategic learning, how we assess our own behaviours and how our behaviours influence the way we do our work with sector and community. So thank you so much for that. For those of you who are staying for the Community of Practice event this afternoon, that will start in about 1 hour. We'll have some lunch for us to share at 12 o'clock. For those who are on the live stream, we will say goodbye to you now. And to the rest of you, thank you so much for coming along. I hope you found it useful, entertaining, informative, and guide your work into the future. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you.